Josh, I think we're live.
Sounds good.
Although I'm concerned about your name, you're for the win. I don't know if
it's like, you got to walk in and set the stage and let people know what's going to happen.
I love the competitive nature. Hello, everybody. It's Ryan Ripley and Josh Anderson. Of course, you know both of us from, for me, Agile for Humans, Josh from Metacast that he does with Bob Galen. We promised a debate. I don't know if it'll be a debate, more like a discussion. We're going to dig into story points, velocity, flow metrics, talk about the pros and cons, shake through a few ideas. We actually have some ideas, some bullet points, maybe even a PowerPoint if needed. So we're going to be a little professional about this and talk point by point. But Josh, you want to introduce yourself real quick to the audience?
Sure thing. Bob and I have been doing the Metacast for way too long. We actually were doing podcasting when people used iPods. So we're around 235 episodes. Working on being more consistent there because we were kind of sloppy throughout the years, but we've tightened it up. Doing a lot of video content, which has been pretty fun, and just helping folks learn. That's all that we're after, is as we see things out in the world, like maybe somebody's spouting off about story points being trash, and we feel this obligation to jump in and say like, whoa, let's slow down here a little bit. But Ryan and I have known each other for quite a while, and certainly this is going to be a thing where we're going to have fun with it, and no friendships will be harmed, no feelings will be hurt. This is just us putting things on the table so that you can make the right decision.
Yeah, it's hopefully it's just a good exploration, some good thoughts, and my hope, and I think Josh's hope as well, is that you walk away from this thinking, first of all, thinking, right? But, oh, maybe I'd never seen it the way Josh had thought about it, or maybe Ryan made a good point here, but Josh we want you to actually, I hope you leave this struggling a bit. Like, oh man, I had assumed one thing, but now this is interesting, and that you go off and do a bunch of research and investigation and all that. But the topic, story points, velocity, we'll kind of lump those together. But Josh, I think you should go first. I was the one running my mouth on Twitter, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. I made the bold comment, story points are trash. I'd like to hear, and I think everyone else would like to hear, why you disagree with that.
Yeah,
right.
I gotcha.
So where do you want to start?
We'll just start with at the top of the list.
All right.
One of the things that I have valued greatly throughout the years is that story points force a conversation to happen. And I've had a lot of high-performing teams. I even had one team where I proposed that we stop using story points. After they picked themselves up off the floor in that room and then came back and we talked about why, it was because they had just gotten really good at ultimately breaking things down into similar sizes and just crushing them. And we talked about it, and they actually went off and had a debate among themselves, and they wanted to keep them because they felt like it kept them honest on making sure we talked through all of the things. So having the willingness and having thought through that story well enough to say this is a 5 and someone says it's a 3, and being engaged to really say, well, this is why it's a 5, and have that good dialogue and help that team narrow in on what the best answer is. Now, at the end of the day, a 5 or a 3 doesn't matter. I don't care. What matters is that the team finds their way to a clear definition of that story where anybody on that team can confidently grab that story off the top of the backlog and go make it happen. That's the goal. That's the definition. And I've been really successful with story points being that thing that forces people to have that discussion. So that's where I've had a ton of success, and that's why I believe in it. I have yet to find another tool that ensures that happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. And we hear this a lot, that the story point usage, it provokes conversation, it provokes discussion. We learn a lot about the work. And I've always thought, totally agree, except we've conflated a few things, right? So I would come back and say planning poker. That is a great analytical tool. I think it's awesome. We're all we're discovering assumptions. We're talking about work. We're breaking down work. We're bringing transparency to our product backlog items because we're creating a whole team understanding. I think it's a great refinement technique. It's a great slicing technique. It's a great overall collaborative technique. I think planning poker is what gets all the benefits of what you've just stated. The team understands the work. The team, oh, look, the tester came up and we all thought this was a 1, but it's really an 8 or a 10 or what, a 21 because the test framework's bad. It's going to take me an extra, X number of cycles to do whatever. That's beautiful. Totally wholeheartedly support that. I just wish we would play planning poker like they play Whose Line Is It Anyways, where the stories are made up and the points don't matter. Like once you're done with planning poker, I wish they would just bin the points and keep the great discussion and knowledge, right? And so I halfway agree with you. I just think it's planning poker that's giving us the value, and then the points that are kind of an effect of doing planning poker lead to a lot of problematic behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One of the things you as a viewer might not have caught was that I don't care about the points. What I care about is that we get there, that the destination is there, and that's our method of getting there. One of the things, and we have to make sure we don't belabor each point because we'll be here for 7 hours.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've found works well for teams is having reference points to get things started and starting to coalesce stories of sizes, and just so it's a starting point. We aren't just guessing like, oh, well, that's like that 5 last week. Let's start there and doing that. So that'll help a team get going, or it helps a product owner get going and get an understanding of where it is and where it's going to be. So that's the other place where beyond the refinement and planning poker, it can be useful. How much value there is in that unique case can be debated, right? And I get it, but that's a thing that's out there.
It's interesting you talk about the reference point technique, and again, I've taught this, I've done this, I've worked with teams on this with varying levels of success. I have to fully admit some teams have done this very well, some teams have done this poorly. What's interesting about that is that the way that you're discussing story points is not actually the intention. Right. I think there have been some evolutions in story point and velocity understanding, but if you look at what Ron Jeffries has to say about it, and I think Chet Hendrickson once accused Ron of inventing story points.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Ron accepted or denied, but I think he just apologized. But that's the myth, right? Who knows what actually happened? But he said in the beginning when he was at the place where they were invented, and it was really just a heuristic. It was, a story point is supposed to represent some type of work that could be completed in a half a day or a day. It was always a time-based measurement. If you look at Mike Cohn's definition, Mike Cohn would say that story points are time, right? And I'll put in the show notes links to the tweets from Ron and the Mike Cohn's article that it is related back to time. And to Mike, it's ideal time if the developers aren't interrupted. And we know the problems with ideal time estimation, but story points have to correlate back because that's what your stakeholders and managers and executives want. And I think he makes a valid point there. But if you look at, what you're talking about with a relative anchor point and then estimating off of that, that's separated from this concept of time that the original story implementation leveraged, and what Mike Cohn would say is what a story point now. And I think they start conversations through planning poker, but the confusion, right? And if it's okay if I pull up a point here real quick, it's so subjective, right? And then you have bloggers and you have executives. So there's a gentleman out there who jumps into these conversations and makes some decent points. Like, so Peter Kretzmann will jump into these conversations, and he's got 2 good blog posts that we'll link in the show notes as well. And he'll say that, this idea of velocity and story points, it's effort, complexity, risk, maybe some time piece mixed in, maybe some capacity. And so you get all of these different definitions, right? And within those definitions, now define effort, now define complexity, now define what kind of time. Is it ideal time? Is it real time? Is it elapsed time? And it just,
yeah.
And everyone's on this weird different piece of understanding. Does that make sense? So I'm with you on anchor the points, work off. That's wideband Delphi. That's been around since the 1970s for the kids out there born in the 2000s, right? But I think it gets, there's so much confusion because it is so subjective, not only at a definition level. So you have Ron Jeffrey saying one thing, Mike Cohn saying another, Peter Kretzmann writing another, but then at a team level, I teach it one way, you teach it another, Mike teaches it one way in his classes, other PSTs on the scrum.org side teach it. And there's just not this consistent understanding. Does that resonate, Josh? Does that make sense?
It's like
By the way, I align with the way you do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think people will start to see that we're likely aligned, but have different histories, that have brought us to this point. I too have explosions in my brain when I walk in somewhere and I ask how they size things, and they have this giant matrix of things that they use. Ultimately, I use story points to get us to a sizing that we're comfortable in as quickly as possible, because we're not going to get it right. So let's not spend a million hours trying to get it exactly perfect. Let's get it good enough again to move forward. And maybe it's good enough for us to move forward for the next refinement session. Maybe it's not ready, but this is good enough to where, oh, we have another couple of weeks. Let's not get crazy. Let's say it's an 8, but revisit it next week, as we have some research we have to do. So again, story points, and I start to understand your angle, Ryan, that they become an anchor, and they really do. So as a leader, you have to work really hard to not let that become an anchor and slow things down. Again, what we're trying to do is get to working software as quickly as possible and actually delivering value. You deliver value with the things you build, not the story points you put on something.
Right.
Doesn't mean anything to anybody, but it is people get very uncomfortable with accepting that our estimates aren't going to be right. And I've just come to that of, we're going to do as good as we can. And any effort that is required to get beyond that is wasted and pretty hefty. So let's just not do that. Let's get to good enough and then go. So I do agree it's subjective, but on my side of the house, that's kind of on purpose, because we don't want to get down to this perfect little thing and then realize, oh crap, we didn't understand this and now it's wrong.
Yeah, I'm not super concerned about the accuracy of the estimate. I agree with you that we're not going to be right, and I don't think any of the estimate proponents any of the story point proponents out there are ever saying that these are accurate, perfect estimates, right? So I don't want to throw that out there. I do think, and maybe this will flow into your next kind of point there, that part of that, the subjectivity that I'm talking about, also relates to, one team's going to do it one way, another team's going to do it another. If I'm an executive looking across these teams, while it is a massive anti-pattern to compare velocities, I'm really tempted to do that, right? Especially if that number gets out in the wild. I think you and I both agree that story point estimation should never leave a team.
Yeah.
But let's, I agree that when I throw a lawn dart with the kids, it should never go through a kid's leg, but they do, right? There's an inherent danger in using certain things, right? And so once that starts happening, we see kind of where this gets, it gets a little interesting. We're trying to compare. It's very subjective, team to team. It's inaccurate on purpose, but that's not always well understood. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But I think this kind of flows into this second point of yours, where Fibonacci scales accuracy with size. Can you kind of peel that apart and kind of relate it to where we're at?
Yeah. So Fibonacci grows pretty quickly and it gets out of hand pretty fast. And I've always used that to say the larger we get, it's clear we don't really know what we're talking about. It's
Sure.
always kind of naturally happened that around a 13, and I never force this is just how it's kind of shaken out, that around a 13, it gets to be too big for a team to kind of make happen. So that's always been the breaking point. Maybe it's a different number for you. It doesn't matter. But after 13, you jump to 21, and then that would be 34, right? And then it just keeps going and going and going, and it just gets bigger really fast. So again, once you get beyond a certain point, it's clear you don't know what the heck you're talking about. So you got to break it down smaller. And that's not a story point thing at all. That's just a unit that is used that I've always used to make sure we recognize when it's out of hand, because there are teams that will try and size these monolithic stories and not realize it's probably like 7 or 8, and let's break it down. And again, there's just a ton of wasted time and effort there. So again, I expect stories to be refined not in one session, but over a period of sessions, because you're going to identify things you don't know that you want to know, that are important for us to know before we start. So you're going to do some research and go and figure that out. Now, unfortunately, there are too many people that do what I call just in time planning, where they're planning for the next sprint, or even worse, this sprint. So you never get to that point where you actually get to see things 2, 3, maybe 4 times. If you're doing it well, that actually happens, but it doesn't happen very often, because sometimes, well, oftentimes product orgs aren't strong enough yet to be able to make that happen. But again, this is just a tool, not a story point thing. You can use this outside of story points, to ensure that you accept the reality that it's like a cone, right? The closer you are, your miss is pretty narrow, but the further out you get, you're going to be all over the place. So like just stop and
Yeah, I
figure out
mean,
what you don't know, and then go.
yeah, the one of the hard truths, and I think this is actually a fact. I don't know if this is debatable. You know the most about the work when you're done.
Yeah.
I think we agree there. Like there's no
Yeah.
contention. And so we're fighting that cone all the way through. I think the only way to battle that cone is to continually reestimate.
Yeah.
In a story point setting, I can see that being expensive, especially for work that's in flight, which is not necessarily well, maybe I can relate this. You know, the second point that I would make here is that stakeholders don't understand story points and velocity, and part of that misunderstanding that I've typically seen, and it's a lot of that falls on me, is poor coaching, right? So I'm not blaming the stakeholders; they don't know what they don't know. I needed to do, especially earlier in my career, a better job of talking through this, right? But what I don't think what they understand is it's a weather forecast; it's not a promise.
Mhm.
You know, right now it looks like it's gonna, we just had that superstorm, the polar vortex or the Arctic bomb or whatever it
Yeah.
was that dropped on the Midwest. Well, I live right near Lake Michigan. And so of course that weather center gets, or that thing drops over Lake Michigan and all heck breaks loose. You know, it messes with the weather. You're close to the coast. You know what water does, or what bodies of water do to weather. It's
Yeah.
crazy. They thought it was going to be 2 feet of snow. It turned out to be 5 inches. Do I go yell at the weather person for being wrong?
Right.
No, something changed. The pattern changed, the data changed. And the second that she knew that, she was on back on the air saying, "Hey, something has shifted. We now know something different. It's not going to be as much snow, but the temperatures, instead of being -10 with the wind chill, are going to be -35. Plan appropriately." So everyone goes down and checks their furnace, right? Says a little prayer and then goes back upstairs. And all right, let's hope this thing keeps running. But we have to change our behavior based off of what we learn. That doesn't always happen with stakeholders. And a lot of it's got to be on us. It's got to be on us to not educate them. But sometimes the expectations get a little weird too. And so when you start letting these things escape a team, the stakeholders look at that and go, well, they said this magical story point thing and their velocity is 20. And that must mean that since, the work that I want is 30 down, that's going to be the next sprint. And it turns into this commitment.
Mhm.
And it just, I don't know, I'm sure you've seen this anti-pattern, but it gets weird at that point.
Yeah, that's what I call executive math. You
Sure.
never want to give executives numbers to play math with, because that's when you get into real trouble and a lot of the bad things happen. Now, where I've lived over the past decade is I've been a part of that team. So I've been able to shut things down and control very quickly once executive math starts to happen, and help them understand. Now, they don't like when I do that, but it's a near full-time job when you're working inside of a company and you represent the product, and there are other leaders across the organization that have never done this. And they do attempt to help, and there is good intent, but they don't know what they don't know. So for you to maintain an understanding with the stakeholders around these things, number one, they should never see them. And when I was calling the shots, they never did. And if they did, it was on me. And I went in and ate crow and figured out how to fix that. But it's a full-time job for somebody to play that defense against all of those, again, with good intentions, but really causing harm. And that's where a lot of the discussion has to be. So, as an agile coach, you have to make sure that you find somebody on that executive team that has your back and is willing to fight that fight. Because just like Ryan said, with the lawn darts, which were super exciting when I was a kid because there was real danger.
Yeah.
Um, uh, Something bad's going to happen, and you have to have somebody that's there on site to be able to triage and fix that problem. And not every place has that, so that's why some of Ryan's points around just don't use them at all could be right. You're going to have to figure out for the team that you have in all directions, is this something that you can safely use?
Yeah. And look, I think that um, the anti-patterns are what they are, and people will argue that, well, just don't do that. It's like the old saying, oh, I went to the doctor and I told the doctor when I move my arm like this it hurts, and the doctor said stop doing that. Okay, I get it. But the reality is these things get out in the wild, and part of it is an absence of giving the executive something better, which is why I lean towards the lean metrics or the flow metrics, right?
Mhm.
Give them something that they can actually make a new and better decision on. But I'm jumping ahead. We did have an interesting comment. Are you okay with a comment from the chat, Josh?
100%. Yeah.
So Stas is here, and he actually has a neat kind of practice here that most often I agree with the teams to use t-shirt sizing when something is size small. Then we can put in a sprint. Then that means it's at least 13 points, and then we go through, the actual ceremony of estimating in points. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's actually a technique that I use where we have this whole we have like three levels of planning. We have the annual roadmap, so like the
Yep.
next 4 quarters that are out there of things we expect to do. Then we have this rolling 6 sprint view where things come off the roadmap and they go into that. And on that roadmap, everything is a t-shirt size because that's like an epic, right? Like you really don't know. You have an idea, you you know what it is, but no one's really dug into it. No one's cracked it open and said, "Holy crap, we're gonna have to rewrite 7 services and all these things." So once it makes it off of there, that's when we start to turn it into story points because number one, we know we're actually going to do it. And
Yep.
then two, we have to start that cycle of refining it 2, 3, maybe 4 times before it gets to the point where the team can grab it with confidence and make it happen. So I 100% support and buy into this method. It's worked for me for like a decade. So Stas, double thumbs up.
We have another interesting comment here. The need for a shared language. So to my stakeholder point, we all need to understand what these things mean, and with all the different terms and with the gurus all being in somewhat disagreement and with the other terms coming in. Of course, our friend here is pointing towards cycle time and throughput. So I'm going to give a double thumbs up, but it's an interesting point, right? A shared language, in Scrum, we have definition of done. We define done for the organization, for the team. And then when we say done, we know what we mean. And sometimes, maybe around estimation, a shared language could be valuable. So, but I think we can get there with story points too. I just think it's a heavier lift for the coaches
Yeah.
and for, I think it is a heavier lift, but I think it's not an exclusive, like you can get there, right?
Yeah. What I try to do is not use terms like that outside of our team.
Yeah. Yeah.
Inside of our team, yes. But when I'm having an update with executives or a sprint review or anything like that, we only ever talk about business value. So
Yep.
that's the only thing that the external org hears from us of this is the value that we are delivering to our customers. Maybe they're you, maybe they're the third party customers, whatever it is, but here's the capability that someone now has that they didn't have. Because again, that's what matters. And I've talked to teams, I've had to say, why do we exist? And often it's like, well, we need to build software, we need to do this. Like, no, we only exist to provide new and useful functionality to somebody. It doesn't matter how elegant the software is, they don't care.
Yeah.
We care because we have to support it, but ultimately we get paid by the value that we create, not the lines of code that we create or by the metrics that we create or spit out or any of that. None of that
Yeah.
really matters outside of our house. But
I
there's so many
hope.
people that try and prove themselves with all these different numbers, and you open a door to danger.
Yeah. I hope lines of code is no longer a metric in use. Well,
Yeah.
and I think the question that this kind of is begging, leads into your third point. So that's kind of serendipitous here. Your third point was who likes driving without a speedometer. I think part of this discussion has to be, all right, you're in sprint review, right? Let's pretend we're in a Scrum context because we love Scrum, right? When a stakeholder turns to you and says, Josh, great, totally understand. You're not going to tell us about story points because who the heck knows what those are? It's for your team. But when will this be done? So how do you answer that in the absence of sharing? I'm with you.
Yeah.
Give the value metrics to the stakeholders. Hey, look, you spent X number of dollars and we delivered 3X in value. The juice was worth the squeeze, double thumbs up. But when they show up and say, that's great, but there's something, 12 items down that's really important to me, Josh, when will that be done?
Yeah. So that's where I show them the 3 different levels of planning, and each level of planning, like Fibonacci, deals with bigger units of measure.
Right.
So the further out we go, the larger units of measure that are used, and it might be out and it's in the next quarter. And I say, well, right now it's planned for the start of next quarter. And so what you can do is I can show them for these next 6 sprints, here's all the things that we're doing that we've deemed more important. And here's why. They'll go, oh, okay, get it. I don't like it, but I get it. So always having those facts throughout there helps make that happen. And I also have to have the talk, just like Ryan said, is that stuff that's out there, we know the least about.
Yep.
Because you know what? That might come off the board. So we're not going to spend a ton of time trying to refine that and know what it is. Once we know we're going to do it, then we'll take the time to really make it happen. Otherwise, I can take the whole team and we can map out everything you ever want to do, and we won't ever write code because there'll always be new ideas and all kinds of things like that. So we're not going to waste time making that happen. So that's how I tackle that is educating them that it is like that weather world where the units just get bigger and everything expands quickly. And smart, reasonable executives understand that.
Yeah. I think it's an answer. I think the lift during that discussion is a lot heavier.
Oh yeah.
Than what we're probably representing right now. Like this is a slow burn discussion. This is a product owner. This is a scrum master. This is a fellow partner executive meeting with the stakeholders repeatedly, trying to get this idea of forecasting, overestimation worked through an organization, especially in a hierarchical, plan-driven type of organization. Let's be honest. A lot of the Fortune 500 operates that way. This is a very difficult discussion. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. And it goes back to what I said a few minutes ago about this is almost a full-time job.
Yep.
Trying to handle the well-intentioned executives to get them to understand why we operate the way that we do. Now, one of the things you have to do is to have that trust is you got to deliver.
Right.
You can't just say, hey, stick with me, trust me, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. That ends really quick with you being somewhere else. So what you've got to do is you got to be able to prove it as you go. Now, the speedometer that I talk about here, again, story points for me stick within the team. So as the holidays come around, and we can normally do about 40, so like let's figure out what planning is. Or one of the things I've seen a lot that is a very bad habit is teams have this, or humans have this desire to try and stuff more in than what fits. The number of times I've sat in a story planning and we've averaged over the last 6 months 40 points. The team hasn't changed, product hasn't changed. We've just been running steady at 40-ish points. But every sprint, the team plans like 50. Like, why are we doing this to ourselves? Like, we've never proven we can hit 50. We average about 40 plus or minus 10%. And that's pretty good. So like, let's plan for what we can do. So I find it useful to be able to hold teams in check because there is this, I can't define it any other way than a human condition or a desire to over deliver in a world where you've yet to prove that can happen. I see it everywhere I go.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the idea, this is capacity-based planning.
Yeah.
And I think this is, if you're good with the speedometer, it might lead into my third point. Is that cool?
Yeah, 100%.
So I think there's limited utility and usefulness of story points and velocity. And it's this capacity-based planning that comes up. I would really define velocity, especially as a lagging indicator of capacity. And I think that's fairly in alignment with one of the sources I mentioned. I think in Peter Kretzmann's blogs, I think he makes a very similar, I'm not going to say exact same case, but it is a capacity-based metric. I see it as a lagging indicator of capacity. And so that's interesting, right? Up to a point. And now if we're forecasting off that, I think that it's a little risky. It's a little dangerous. The limited utility. I mean, let me show kind of, is it all right, Josh, if I show kind of what I mean there?
Yeah, totally. Yep.
So when I think about a limited utility, look, we pretend that day one of a sprint, it's end of sprint planning. So we have used velocity to build this great plan. We have all these PBIs in the sprint. We've decomposed the work. We have an initial plan. Let's get started. In my opinion, the usefulness of story points and velocity ends here. We can't use these to help us any further. You can use a sprint burn down chart, but I'm a big advocate of lighting your burn down charts on fire. I don't think these are used. A lot of problems hide in between the dots, right? So you could have your workflow. You could have every card moved up to doing. You could have everyone but 3 to done, and your burn down still looks decent because you're burning work, you're burning tasks, and things are flowing. And at the end, it's why you get the hockey stick kind of burn down charts, right? So a lot of problems hide in these areas. And so I don't think story points help us with predictability, progress, anything like that through the sprint. Once we're out of sprint planning, the utility ends. Let me pause there and see what you think.
I agree and disagree. I agree because once a story has been sized and it's in a sprint, we don't change it because it doesn't, like, what does that prove? That, oh, it was really a 3. That doesn't prove anything. It's not worth doing. I actually like to use a burn down throughout the sprint so that we can make sure, just as a reminder to the team, we are on the path for a hockey stick or a cliff or whatever you want to call it. So we
Sure.
clearly are not good enough at our whip limits or getting things to actually done. What are those things that we are doing wrong, that we're missing, that are causing this continual just cliff diving at the very end? Because that's not a healthy situation. And to your point in flow, like, we're not actually flowing. We're like doing, up, done. And that's not the way things should be working. That's not an optimal way to work. So again, I agree it's limited utility, and I view it as intentionally that way because you should not use this as your single metric. I always talk to teams about, it's a dial in a cockpit. That's it.
Yep.
None of these dials say whether you're flying well. You have to be able to zoom back and look at these things and understand, yeah, we're actually doing pretty well. But I've had so many teams that really struggle with getting over that because they have a history of being burned by metrics over and over again. So that's a challenging discussion to have.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, like from a utility and usefulness idea. So first, key point, lagging indicator of capacity. That is velocity. At least that's my definition. I haven't heard you push back too much on that. I think we're okay there. It's hard to identify bottlenecks and improvement opportunities off of a burn down chart. So there's this, but I don't think these ideas were meant to solve these problems.
Right.
Right. And so what I'm expecting of it is unfair, but it's also what's expected of it in organizations. And so I'm highlighting these anti-patterns. From a short-term planning perspective, I think sprints can be so volatile that, you had a team normalize out at 40, which is great, but how many sprints does that take?
Yeah.
That's 6, 7, 8, 9, 12. How many ever? Maybe we should use Fibonacci to figure out how many sprints it takes to normalize out. Right.
Yeah.
And so from a short-term planning perspective, it's very volatile. And can lead to variance. I also think when someone looks at a velocity chart, right? So velocity over time, this sprint we did 20 points, this sprint we did 40, this next sprint we only did 3, and people start looking at that. And and actually an activity that Todd and I do, Todd Miller, the co-founder of Agile for Humans, we teach a lot of courses together. What an activity that he came up with was, here's a historical velocity chart from a team that he worked with, and it's all over the place. right? So exactly, 10s and 40s and threes, and we say put a post-it note on this velocity chart that represents what you think about this team, and 97%. And Todd's doing a bunch of statistical work on this. I think we're gonna publish something around this.
Ooh, that's exciting.
It's like 97% of the comments are negative. So he has this this tone, or I forget but it's this analysis that's run that says this word is negative, this one is positive. I think it's around 90% negative. And it's just amazing because this is a team that delivered insane amounts of value every sprint. They won multiple industry, local, state, national, international awards. The company that team worked at, they spent, tons of money to keep them together, but their velocity chart looked like garbage. And so it's one of those where this limited utility and usefulness, I don't think it can be overstated, because we run into these, I took a glance at a velocity chart and I think this team needs correction and they're unreliable and they're not delivering. And it's furthest from the truth. But even on a long term, this dependence on historical data, especially averages, you hear so many teams say, well, we averaged our velocity and this is what we think we can do. I mean, the flaw of averages, look, if you want to average velocity over 1,000 data points, I think you're okay. Most teams haven't done 1,000 sprints. And so the flaw of averages, and for those of you not familiar with this concept, it's the idea that if we're all sitting in a bar and Bill Gates walks in, or Elon Musk walks in, or pick your favorite billionaire of the week, on average, we're all millionaires now, right? Because on average, they have an insane amount of money. That doesn't work. And so even the averages get weird, and we just try. What I think, Josh, in our industry, in our Agile community, we expect so much of story points and velocity, and that we've stretched them to represent things that they can't possibly represent, and it's led to anti-patterns and bad practices and upset teams and rightly ticked off executives, and a lot of misunderstanding, faulty assumptions, and unmet needs. And I think it's at the root is this idea of limited utility and usefulness.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So again, when I see something like that, I assume positive intent from a team and they're working their tails off.
Right. Totally agree.
So where I go is, what's causing them to operate like that? Is it a poor product organization and they don't have a roadmap, so they're reactive and they're finding things out last minute, so they get started on things and they uncover a bunch of difficulties that are out there, or it turns out to be way easier than they thought? Or are there other factors that are creating that? So that 97% doesn't surprise me, but my assumption is 70% of that is people not assuming good intent from those teams. And nobody goes to work and wants to do a bad job. Right. Nobody wants to go to work and come home and say, yeah, I really stunk it up today. Like that's not how humans work. So you have to just assume that that's already in the mindset that's there. But what struggles is this team up against? And to your point, story points could be the thing that's causing that. But so many people jump and react to that same issue, which is why, again, I said it's very hard to use any metric with a team, because so many teams and so many people have been abused by a metric or 5 throughout their past, and now like any of them is terrifying because they have this just like this PTSD of, oh, the last time that happened, we were doing good, but the executives thought we sucked and all these things. So it's a delicate balancing act, which goes back to that full-time job of trying to keep people out of the kitchen and in the dining room. Keep them in the dining room. The kitchen's always a mess. Yes, things are happening. Pots are boiling over, stuff's burning, doing all this stuff. But what you present out into the dining room, control that.
Yeah. So, Josh, I think we're probably ready for point number 4, right?
Yeah.
So your point number 4, make the physics or work work.
Sorry, physics of work.
Physics of work. Oh,
yeah,
my bad. I'll fix that while you start to explain it.
So to me, that just goes back to having a basic understanding of who we are and what we can do. It's like the speedometer a bit, but you can start to understand and start to look at history. So one of the things that we did was we had 7 teams that stayed together for a long time. And our agile coaches actually started tracking for things in the annual roadmap that were sized in a t-shirt, small, medium, or large. What did those stories end up being? And did they actually end up being of similar size? So how good were we with the estimates of the epics? And we found out that we actually did pretty good. Now then, of course, the debate started of, well, are people sizing them because they know it was a small? So then like that's how it gets like, right? There got to be this whole debate, but you can start doing the physics of, okay, so, and again, this was strictly in-house. If we added another team, what would that look like? Because we've added 7, we know how long it takes us to get a team up and running, and we know on average, loose average, kind of what we can do. We didn't force teams to standardized story points across the board. That wasn't a thing that we forced. Whereas many people would say, well, you can't figure anything out if you don't do that. Well, no, that's not really real. You can figure things out. But again, you got to understand you're forecasting on a forecast. And
Yeah.
that's a dangerous thing. So you have to understand what it is and what it isn't and accept the truth of it's a forecast on a forecast, maybe on a forecast. So it's like inception at that point, and you have to just realize what you're dealing with. But you can start to play physics with things, and this is super dangerous in executive land because then everything turns into Legos. Like, oh well, like we just had this and we had this and we had this and we had this, then everything's gonna be perfect, right? And like, no, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't scale on a linear fashion. There's all kinds of craziness things that are out there. There's humans here, so it's a little bit messier than writing code. But you can
Yeah.
start to do some physics math, is what I say, within the team, and don't ever take it outside of your team because it's going to get misused a million trillion ways. So so that's the angle that I'm coming at there.
No, and I think I've seen that. I've made similar observations about teams. So
Mhm.
I totally agree. You can have this normalization happen, and please don't standardize on story points across teams or an org. That's
Yeah.
not a great. That's another anti-pattern. I've actually been reading a book by a good friend, Doc Norton, on escape velocity. I don't know if you've seen this one yet, Josh.
Yeah.
He
Yep.
makes a lot of points about those anti-patterns too. If you want to read more, this is if this were an academic paper, I would footnote this book. It's a really good read. But a lot of the things you're talking about, I think we have to talk about the fragility of the math,
Yeah.
right? And I think that some of these issues actually apply to the flow metric side as well. So I think I have to concede a partial flaw in that approach as well as we talk about these deficiencies. If team composition changes, this is all blown out of the water. If dependencies are not if they're not professionally dealt with, and what I mean is minimized to almost zero, or at least insanely well understood that we know how to manage that impact, all of this stuff goes out the window. If our product backlog or sprint backlog is incredibly volatile, if we're in a market that's moving very quickly and changing rapidly, all of this is up for grabs. I mean, is that fair?
Yeah. Yes.
So it also requires, I think, a lot of discipline in order for whether it's story points or flow metrics. I'm going to say both for either one to actually be effective in your organization.
Yeah. So when we started to study this, the agile coaches that I had were good and they were stubborn and they chose to reset everything anytime a person changed on a team. And I
Perfect.
was like, no, come on, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But over time, they were right, which I had to admit. But it is the system changes. So you cannot apply any idea, any metric that is in the past to the current. So we couldn't use anything. We couldn't look at velocity. We couldn't look at anything. It's like, this is a new system. Let's not assume anything. And they were right. I didn't like it, but they were right.
Yeah. No, I think that's an incredibly important point, and that makes sense. Anything else about the physics of the work and making that
Nope.
work?
Nope.
So maybe we'll jump over to my number 4. I don't believe so. You've talked about three levels of estimation and a forecast of a forecast of a forecast. And I think there's a lot of Harry Potter in there. I think you've got to, wave the wand and hope that this works. And you're smiling, but you're
Yeah.
nodding. And there's
Yeah.
some, you do that math and then you look at it and go, oh, I don't want to share that. Like this
Mhm.
is terrifying. And part of the idea that I have here is that, and by the way, I've done this too. Like I've done the forecast of a forecast, and so I've committed the sins that you're talking about, and I've repented. I'm just teasing you, but I don't think a lot of this is applicable outside of the team. And so I
Yeah.
get concerned when I see story points getting used at a portfolio level, at a KPI or OKR or an evidence-based management level discussion. And it's why this point is why I started really getting interested in Daniel Vicanti's work. So I have the privilege of knowing Dan very well. We spent 4 hours on a train in Germany, and we were writing with a grease pen on the windows, which really ticked off the conductor. But by the end of that 4 hours, he had me convinced that story points outside of a team context, like we've talked about, just are problematic. It was the organizational discussion that got me. And I think I'm going to try to illustrate this by first looking at a team, right? So a Scrum team using Kanban or flow metrics, these are all pretty straightforward. Work item age, WIP limits, work in process, throughput, and cycle time, right? So these are the big ones. So cycle time, throughput, WIP limits, work item age. And so when I think about these, I can pull these up to a portfolio. I can take a look at a project and say, what's the average cycle time of a project or product initiative in our organization? How many do we finish? Like, what's the throughput of a product or project in our organizational flow? If I look at item age, like something is taking a little bit longer than we would expect, I can bring that up to a portfolio level, and that should highlight a project that's in trouble, or at least one that we need to investigate. If I'm looking at WIP, I know that if we have more than 5 projects, for example, in flight in this organization, we stop delivering. It's also back to that utility and usefulness discussion. If I'm doing this at a team, I can elevate the discussion to a portfolio, and I can elevate the discussion to these organizational initiatives, and we're all speaking the same language, right? So we know that through these 4 flow metrics, right, that um, what we're talking about, that we're trying to visualize work, and that when we say the work item age on this project, or I'm sorry, the work item age on this OKR, the work item age on this project, or the work item age on this sprint backlog item is off, that's a signal to everybody, because we have a common language and a common definition, that something needs to be looked at because this is running behind, or whatever it is. And so I think this idea of applicability is important, because we can take the flow metrics and the ideas of flow-based work and elevate it all the way up. Where before we talked about, you know, velocity and story points, they have a lot of negatives. They have a lot of possible anti-patterns, and their utility ends at the sprint, which I think we loosely agree on, but I think you
Yeah.
also made some good points that expand it. But with this, we can go 3 levels of the organization and not have to do a forecast of a forecast of a forecast. Does that make sense?
Um, it feels like we're doing the same thing with different words, because we still, as a responsible product team, have to evaluate how we're doing based on a plan, which is the same thing that you're talking about. And as we update that 6 sprint view that I talk about, we always validate and look at what we've planned for that quarter effectively. Like, are we delivering on that? Are we on time? Is that happening? So we've used similar terms like this, but at the end of the day, we're both trying to solve the same thing.
Yeah.
What the tool is, whether it's a needle nose plier or regular plier, at the end of the day, we're still trying to turn the crank and figure out, are we turning as fast as we thought? Is the turn working? Is it breaking? What's going on? So, uh, to me, I think this is another one of those things where we're all trying to do the same thing, and sometimes a dogmatic approach gets in and says, hey, like, this actually solves a problem that something doesn't else solve, but like you can solve it with the other thing. It just gets down to what you prefer and what you like and how things have worked for you. And sometimes maybe not even that. It might be the culture of the organization that you stepped into. It
Right.
might not be right for you to bring your historical approach to this new org because that might just blow their brains. And maybe you can get there over 5 years, but you got to be comfortable doing that. So uh, to me, I get you. And yes, story points, again, should never leave the team or the product org. So 100% agree. But after that, we're all trying to produce and solve the same things in similar ways. And I do think that is potentially some of the issues that we see with Agile across the board is that there is no, it was never meant to solve that. Scrum was not meant to solve that. But people try and apply things that weren't meant to solve things like story points to solve these bigger, badder problems. And we as an industry, I don't think are good enough at maybe it's we don't share well enough, or maybe people are stuck in organizations that don't really want to hear about it. I'm not sure what the answer is there, but we haven't solved that problem yet.
Well, I think there's a lot of fascinating phenomena that happen when we get to, especially with the flow metrics, when the data gets real.
Mhm.
I do not believe that people act more rationally in the presence of data. I
Yeah.
think they believe, I believe they act irrationally in the presence of data. And what I mean by that is if you start showing that the item age of a project portfolio is bad, that they're aging rapidly, there's too many things in process. Well, there's someone behind the scenes that that made the decision to start those 6 things that are no longer moving.
Yeah.
And when that data starts emerging, that puts a big flashlight on, well, wait, I made bad decisions. And so rather than taking the opportunity to make a new and better decision, some would take the position of, well, I got to make this right, or I'm going to use a different measure, or it just, you get into these human dynamics, right? And I think that's one thing that happens. I think you're also absolutely right. There are some companies where this would just be disastrous, like whether the emergence of too much data would cause issues. There's other organizations that are not ready for these ideas. There's some orgs that would absolutely love to have it, and so context is important. I think you also highlight a really good rule about best practices. Just because flow metrics worked great in one organization does not mean it will work in another. There's no such thing as a best practice when you're doing complex work, right? Scrum doesn't fit everywhere. Flow metrics don't fit everywhere. And it's not because these tools are bad. It's because um, it's because the org or the context isn't ready. Richard threw a nice comment: "We're too smart for our own good. No one is willing to say that we're wrong," and that's what data provokes that that thing. And so we have to be careful with this, right? Um, Stas is back. Velocity based on story points is ruining the reputation of the Conan uncertainty, in my opinion. I don't know if the Conan uncertainty has a good rep. I think it's kind of sketchy. It's been behaving badly. No, it's an interesting point that and then one other here: flow based metrics are actionable by the team doing the work. I tend to agree with that, especially if you agree with the um if you agree with the idea that velocity, that story points, especially, that their utility ends at the end of sprint planning, right? So if they're a lagging indicator of capacity and if they help us figure out the capacity for a sprint, then I think that's probably correct. That they actually help us sort out what we can do, and that's it. And that the flow based metrics are more actionable. Not everybody agrees with that, right? I don't know, Josh. I just spewed out a lot.
No,
What are some of your thoughts there?
um, I think a key capability that is valuable beyond belief is being able to understand the agile maturity of an organization. And is it responsible of you to hand them this very sharp knife that, when wielded by an expert, can do wondrous things, but when wielded by the average person, is going to cause a bloodbath? And so that's where, as you're interviewing with a company or just coming on board with a team or anything like that, that's one of the key things to understand, because I have made the mistake that we talked about where I just blindly stamped out of, this has worked for me in the past, we're doing this. And yes, we just acquired a company from Europe and they're going to run the way that we run. And like, no, the cultures are completely different. But you have to understand along that evolution of agile maturity of the organization when it's right to bring some of these things in, because you will be more effective if you bring story points or flow metrics or whatever you want in at the right time, as opposed to just like hammering it in on day one when the team's not ready for it and it's a bad plan, and now you've ruined it. You can never bring it in because you've burned yourself, you burn the team, you burn the company. Nobody's going to want to hear about it. So understanding where they are on that journey is going to be real important for you to do the right thing for that company.
Yeah, contextually, I think it's super important. We have to. It's got to be a good fit, and I agree with you. This is the flow-based metrics are a very sharp instrument. They can
Yeah.
definitely cut deep.
Yeah.
And with story points and velocity, maybe it's a more blunt or crude instrument that if swung too hard can knock you out.
Yeah.
And the tool can be used in good or bad ways, and I think that's a fair point on both the flow-based metric and on the story point side. And it's another one we have to probably concede that used incorrectly, they're going to cause damage. Oh, there's our good friend. He's watching me closely, making sure that I'm not saying story. I haven't said it at all.
That's
I've
correct.
actually been complimentary of your work, Peter. Come on now. All right.
I can vouch for Ryan that he has not said that. Now, behind the scenes on Discord, to me, he's been saying it a lot. So, but that's a different thing.
Very funny. All right. So I think we're down to our last points here. Josh, your last point, your point number 5. You own the usage. Tell us more about that.
This is very similar to some of the things that we've talked about around when you introduce this thing. Do you introduce it well? Do you introduce it in a timely manner when it's appropriate, as we just talked about, for that organization team along their journey of becoming truly agile? Are they ready to use this weapon precisely? Or are you giving a child a katana blade and everybody's in trouble at that point? So it's on you to make sure that you introduce, define, and corral over time, because that gate's going to swing open. There's going to be some cattle that get out, and you got to make sure you get out quickly and corral them back in and put them in the pen where it's safe to play. Now, maybe that pen expands over time. It should, as that journey goes for that team, and you start to let more people into that pen, and and now there's like a stream they can go play in or whatever. But just understanding when it's right and how to handle that, and that you are going to quickly and precisely reel it back in when it gets out of control, because it will. You are not going to introduce this and it's not going to be perfect every time. We talked about halfway through about this is a darn near full-time job to make sure and defend for your team that these things aren't getting misused.
Yep.
So just own that once you bring this in, you have to be ready to allocate and dedicate time to ensure that this continues to be implemented in a healthy manner. Because if not, it'll get out of control, and out of control quickly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think those same caveats apply to implementing flow-based metrics, right? If we're not doing this intentionally and carefully, it will lead to issues. What I like about this, I don't know. What I like about this is you owning the usage. I mean, you've been incredibly fair about this idea that it's a full-time job, bringing story points and velocity to the forefront, using that as a metric, tamping down. I just want to make sure I'm hearing you right. Tapping down the anti-patterns. We know there's some are going to happen. Yep. And they're going to happen on the flow metric side too, but being very aware of those, making sure no stakeholders, we're not comparing velocities of teams. We're not going to normalize story points across teams. This isn't really a great way to predict the future. We're just making sense of a capacity for a sprint. It's a lagging in. We're doing all that full time, all the time. And I think that's incredibly fair. You have to own the usage, whether it's one method or another.
So I want to jump in and admit and accept the fact that story points are more broadly understood, with air quotes. So they are more likely to get misused because that air quote understood means they're misunderstood. But
Right.
people think they know what they're for. So it's a more common tool that people are comfortable with. So the likelihood of misuse is definitely higher. So you have to know that walking in.
Well, and we talked about that, right? So we
Yep.
talked about, Ron Jeffries giving a definition of a day or a half day's worth of work. We talked about Mike Cohn relating it back to time with risk and other factors that are largely undefined mixing in. We talked about Peter Kretzmann's work, his blog posts, where it's more capacity based, and we'll link to those blog posts so people can check out his work on it. And that understanding, I think, comes from so many different definitions.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just it's on the community to sort that out. If you're going to use velocity and story points, be consistent. And so maybe a group needs to get together and sort out what they mean. But in any case, if you introduce this practice, you own the usage. I wholeheartedly agree with that. The last point I'll make, and then we'll wrap this up because we've already gone an hour here. Why eat a hot dog when you can have a steak? And it's and yes, I am known for saying that story points are trash. I find that it's a brash comment, right, Stas? There you go. It's a brash comment. But it also it's highlighting the intent is to highlight the fact that they are super limited in use. And I think we've established some
Yeah.
of that. My viewpoint is at the end of sprint planning, they're no longer useful. But then they're used for so many weird purposes. And to your point, Josh, if you're not owning that implementation of story points and velocity and not managing that full time, they can and will get out of control. Is that we're good so
Yep.
far?
Yep.
And so from my perspective, why go down this path and why have to do forecasts and some of this magic that goes behind it when you have a better option, right? So I would rather, when I get the question of when will it be done, which is it's an appropriate question.
Mhm.
It is a good question, and stakeholders have the right, and managers, executives, leaders, they all have the right to ask it, and they should ask it, and they should expect a decent answer. I want to fire up our metrics program and say, look, and actually our good friend Richard beat me to the punch. He goes, Monte Carlo simulation. Of course, that's where I'm going. I don't think you can do this off of story points with any degree of confidence. Maybe I'm sure someone will challenge me on that. Let me know in the comments if you've got a way to do this with story points. But with the flow metrics, we can actually apply Monte Carlo simulation. This is a screenshot from Actionable Agile. You can do this I know Jira has some of these tools now. I know there's ways to do this. Troy McGinnis has spreadsheets you can download that will do this. Whipping up a Monte Carlo spreadsheet is not the most monumental of tasks. You can do that as well. But when a stakeholder says, what does it take to finish the rest of this product backlog? Well, it's this date is what we're currently forecasting. It's 95% confident based off of our past work and 1 million simulations. And the second we do some more work, this is going to update. And we're going to keep sending this to you, right? And this is going to trigger a conversation. If someone says, well, wait a minute, it's got to be January. It can't be February. Now we're talking about scope. Because we have the data here, we remove the emotion from the conversation. We're not talking about magical points. And we can run the simulation in real time with the stakeholder and say, well, if we cut the scope in half, we can hit January. So now what's above the line and below the line? And these are the conversations I'm trying to point us towards. And can you get here with story points? Probably. And I have to concede that. But can we do this at the team level, at a project level, at a portfolio level, and an org level with these same tools and have a consistent conversation? This is the steak. This is where I cut in. And it's that juicy red, and I don't need A1 sauce or ketchup. It's just beautiful the way it is. And I can take that bite and I'm just happy. What do you think, Josh?
Well, number one, the ketchup.
Ugh.
Yeah. So it brings me back to my favorite quote from Steven Universe, where his dad tells him that if every pork chop were perfect, we wouldn't have hot dogs. So, there's that. So I agree with you but I agree that story points, well, I stand by the fact that story points have a place. Story points have a place to get you to operating. They are what I believe to be a very useful tool. I'll say most useful tool because that's what I've used and continue to use to get items ready to be worked on. Then I agree with you wholeheartedly that at that point, value is very limited and you still need to figure out all of those things. What I don't understand is how flow metrics help you prior to doing the work. How do you get there? What do you do? How do you plan, pack a sprint? Do you just do work items? We can do 7 work items in a sprint. Like how does that shake
Yeah.
itself out? So to me, everything you're talking about, yes, agree, should do it, got to do it, but that's all once the train's left the station. There's still work that has to get the train loaded with people and ready to roll. So that's the bit that I don't understand how this solves those problems.
Yeah, I think sprint planning we use throughput, and then some work item age discussions. So throughput, I would say it's just number of items that we can get through our system of work over a
Right.
period of time. That period of time is sprint. It looks very similar to velocity.
Yeah.
And a lot of people highlight, well, they're the same thing. Well, wait a minute, they're not. Velocity is typically an averaging of story points. And someone can call me out on that definition if they want to improve it. I'm open to an improved definition. Throughput would be number of items that flow through a system over the period of a sprint in the case of a Scrum team. And so, what I think is the commonality, the linchpin between these two practices is that I still expect teams to do product backlog refinement. And I think that is the catch, right? So in your case, you're using Planning Poker. I use Planning Poker. I think Ellen Gottesdiener has some great materials here as well on how to refine and understand work. I think her Discover to Deliver book, which is unfortunately out of print, had some really beautiful ideas on this. Whatever practice you're using, that refinement leads to sized work. And whether you're using a heuristic like, oh, a day or less, which I think is fine, 3 days or less, it can fit in a sprint, or if you're using story points, the linchpin is the refinement.
Yeah.
And once we get there, then throughput informs capacity in a sprint, just as velocity could inform capacity in a sprint, and then we're off to the races, managing our work through item aging in a daily scrum, work in progress during a daily scrum. At the sprint review, we're going to talk about our throughput. We're going to bring up some cycle time issues, especially from a service level expectation perspective. From a retro, we're going to talk about all this.
Mhm.
Did we let out something age too much, right? So do we have did we end up with the rotten banana? Did something stay, did an item stay in dev way too long? Which is a great discussion. But yeah, I agree with you. And the linchpin, I think, is product backlog refinement.
Yeah. Again, we're solving the same problems.
Mhm.
We use slightly different tools, but in the end, we are trying to get things in a healthy state to be worked on with confidence, and we're using different tools but similar tools to get it there. And then once everything's out in the wild and being worked on and all that stuff, then there's measurements and understanding about how things are going.
Yep.
And um, I have a traditional approach. Well, traditional is not correct. My traditional approach is less by the book and more situational and responding, trying to be agile in that truest sense of as we figure out who we are, this is how we're going to roll. Now you have tips and tricks in your bag that you're ready to use, but I have burnt myself many times on coming in with an answer and then realizing that I wasted a couple of months of time and energy when like that wasn't the right tool.
Right.
So I have stopped coming in with a stamped out this is how we're doing things. I know the objectives we have and I have options for us to get there, but I have yet to see that single well, I'm lying when I say that because I use story points every time. So uh it's rare that I especially on the bigger, broader stuff where you start to forecast out the next quarter or year, there's always a little bit of wiggle room that you've got to work with to make it fit just right for everything that's going on that's led up to that, because every org
Right.
isn't the same. But I have to go back on my word and say the story points are a thing I bring with me everywhere I go.
Yeah. Well, and I think an interesting experiment could be to look at the flow metrics alongside of it.
Yeah.
So you don't even have to stop. What if you just start it? Because I think, like I said, most of the tools, Azure DevOps, Jira, Actionable Agile sits on top. Troy McGinnis has spreadsheets that can help you. There's all sorts of great tools out there. And if you just started tracking them alongside velocity and just see what the differences, the variances, and whether or not all I'm trying to do with any practice, right? Trying to provoke a conversation as soon as possible about what's going on in our system so that we can create opportunities to make new and better decisions constantly. Like that's all I want to do. And that's my guiding principle. That's the golf swing thought. Does this allow me to provoke a conversation that creates an opportunity for an executive or a product owner or a leader or a manager, whatever the context is, to make a new and better decision over and over and over again? And if we accomplish that, whether it's velocity, story points, flow metrics, or whatever else, we're winning. If we're not doing that, and if we're getting surprised a lot, that could be a signal to examine your practices.
Ryan, I am not what someone would call a God-fearing man, but amen.
Amen.
Amen. Like
All
that,
right.
that's the mindset that you win with. There's a lot of other things that can be used to help solve those problems. Ryan has thoughts and ideas. I have thoughts and ideas. But if you have that mindset and you can infuse that mindset in your team, you're going to win, period, regardless of almost the tools that you pick, because that mindset is what's going to win. So that's, amen. Amen.
Cool. I think we'll end there. We had a quick thank you, interesting discussion. Thanks for bringing it forward. You are welcome. Let me check the comments here. Josh, you're getting teased a little bit. The Agile Donut is still magical.
Yes. Richard, I have thought about productizing the donut, so maybe you and I should talk.
That looks good. Some quick questions. I'll answer this real quick. How are you able to extract data from Jira? Actionable Agile is the top tool that I think does that pretty well. I think there's actually some reports you can run inside. Leave some comments on the video. I'm sure some people will be able to help, and maybe Todd, Josh, myself will jump in and help as well. Apparently, there's a Chrome plugin. Check that out.
Nice.
Stas. Amen. And just a lot of thanks in the chat. So, Josh, I appreciate you taking a little more than an hour here to talk about this. I know that my original tweets provoked a lot of emotion, which is part of the purpose, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I want to have better conversations about tools. And I think you've helped me understand where people are at with story points. And I hope the flow metrics, I hope there's a bug in your ear now, maybe to try them side by side. Don Miller says, thanks.
Yep.
You're welcome, Don. Another thank you. You're welcome. And maybe that provokes some people to try something new, which is all that we're after, right? Run them side by side, see if there's a new opportunity to ask better questions and make new decisions. And maybe that helps you win.
Agree. Keep experimenting.
Should we do the Metacast close, Josh? I'm Ryan Ripley from Valpo.
Yeah. Go ahead, knock it out.
No, I'm teasing.
Oh, okay, fine.
So, but Josh, I appreciate you. I hope we get to do this again on a different topic. This was fun. And we'll see everybody next time. Leave your questions and comments in the YouTube channel on the video. We'll try to follow up. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss a video. Get over to the Metacast side as well. Check out Josh. He does a lot of work on Twitch. So he is live streaming weekly on Twitch. Kazi.io is what you would find there. Check him out on YouTube. Check out their podcast. He does a great podcast, The Metacast with Bob Galen. I listen to it every week. I even tease them on Twitch every once in a while when they're live. So I think everybody should be listening to these two as well. But hit that bell, get the notifications, do all of that fun stuff. And we'll see everybody next time.
Good deal. Take care, everyone. Thank you.